Thank you, everybody, for hopping on. Um, the intent of this is not to have like a 45-minute lecture. It's really just to sort of share some thoughts on what I'm seeing in the marketplace, working on a bunch of different projects around the country, even around the world, of different sizes, different scales, ground up, renovation, big, small. Climbing, pickleball, skateboarding, other activities, childcare, whatever it might be. Those are sort of the things that I've been working on the last, call it 3 to 6 months, pretty intently, which is really why I've been making less content, frankly, was really just because I've been very busy with client work. And so, it sort of occurred to me though, as I have been doing these projects, how much of it actually shares a lot of themes that I wanted to talk about today, just as sort of different lessons that I keep coming back to. And so the intent here is to really talk for probably 20, 25 minutes and then have another 20, 25 minutes if anybody has any questions. So a lot more informal than maybe some of the webinars, but also kind of thinking that I'll be doing this kind of like once a month going forward, just with current themes, especially in a day and age right now where we're just seeing a lot of volatility around pricing, let alone everything else going on in the world, which affects the construction industry as much as anything else, arguably. And we're definitely seeing that. So, if anybody's having any issues, I'm going to pull the chat up. Feel free to mention if you're having any issues, or if you have any comments or themes that you want me to circle back to at the end, I'd be happy to touch on that. So please feel free to put anything into the chat as I get going here. So one of the things that I'm going to go through a couple very sort of nuts and bolts things, and then some higher level thoughts. And there's probably like 5 themes here, a couple of which are very quick, including this one. So energy and code. One thing that we're seeing a lot these days is as we're going through changes of use for existing buildings, because so many of the buildings that we deal with are something that used to be something else. So whether it's retail or manufacturing or some other commercial use that we're now turning into some sort of recreational activity use, uh, or even just doing enough work on a building might trigger different upgrades. And energy code continues to get more specific and restrictive and higher degrees of requirement for things like insulation, glazing, just different things that are frankly not where most existing building structures are currently at. And especially when you go from, say, like a warehouse or manufacturing to in actually like an occupied use, not only do you need to add bathrooms and things like that, most likely, but some of the energy code, I'm triggering this because energy code upgrades have become something that is almost not possible to achieve. So it more or less needs to be negotiated. And what I mean by that is that a building department's requiring you to insulate the entire envelope of, say, a 20,000 square foot building. That may be as much as the budget is for the other work you need to do on the building itself, or inside the building. So that's the kind of thing that will nuke your project and needs to be sort of considered before we get too far down the road, or at least talked through with local building authorities, because there's this double-edged sword of, yes, buildings should be efficient. Yes, we don't want to be burning and wasting energy. These are all the right goals, but the way that we're getting there can be incredibly prohibitive for people starting businesses. And so it's one of those things where I call it a negotiation, because often the intent or the way that we actually get approvals might not be the letter of the code that is required. And so it's just something that I'm flagging as a very real issue, that as the newer codes, 2024 and onward, are being applied to newer projects, we're sort of past the grandfather period on a lot of these things. And so this is a whole conversation in and of itself, but I'm just going to leave it at something to keep in mind, that an existing building that is sort of low insulation, low energy quality in terms of standards, may need significant upgrades. And so it's worth considering, is that something you have to do? Is that something a landlord has to do since it's their building? If you're just renting it, you're not renting the insulation, you're renting the space inside of it. Or is it something that can be negotiated with the building department? Because it's also in the city's interest, wherever you are, to have businesses up and running. And so there's this sort of figuring out how to get to yes, how to get to an agreement. You're doing enough. Maybe it's upgrading mechanical systems, like whatever it is that you are doing that will get you the approvals you need within a climate of, pardon the pun, of having more difficult energy standards to obtain. So that's the first sort of theme I wanted to bring up. Uh, in line with that, base building requirements. If you're someone who is, whether it's buying land or leasing a space, the space that you're plugging into is more and more, from what I'm seeing, because costs are so high for all of the capital improvements we're doing. If you pick the wrong building, your budget may not be able to be attainable. And so, what I mean by that is that if you're having to do a bunch of work on the building shell, if you're having to replace air conditioning systems, if you're having to sort of upgrade a bunch of broken windows or insulate the building shell, like I was just talking about, your budget that, especially for lower budget projects, may go way up 30, 40%, even 100%, going from like $1 million to $1.5 million or something like that, which is very easy when you're talking about six-figure additions of things like air conditioning and whatnot. The reason why I think this is even more critical today is because we're seeing a lot of smaller projects. The cost of things is just very high right now. And the fastest way to save money on a project is just to simply build less of it. And so when you have a budget that is, say, a little bit on the lower end, and what I mean by that is, to me, a budget that's $1 million is actually a fairly tight budget. Below that, we are very low budget projects, which are hard to hit, and we have to be extremely strategic with how we play that game. But especially if you're below $1 million or even below $2 million, you can't just add another three or $400,000. You're either saying that's another 50% or another, say, 30 or 40% potentially. You just do that math, and intuitively we can tell that makes it really difficult. And so site selection becomes extremely important in terms of being able to hit the target budget numbers. Same building, same size, same rent, but different work that has to go into it can create very different effects. And so, I made this slide a long time ago for a talk I gave, but just to sort of reiterate it, if you're building a new building and you're sort of going ground up and you're saying it's about $300 a foot, and, you're sort of doing all the work, base building, specialty furniture and fixtures, so say climbing walls, HVAC, structural, we kind of know that we have to do all of that. And so that's fine. It's sort of all, maybe keeps a blended number that's relatively in line with our estimate. But if you're someone who is saying, I'm going to do a renovation project, and the two columns on the right, I'm targeting, say, $80 a square foot. And I'm saying, from my perspective, this is a real number because we are delivering projects at this rate. So the problem is, say that they're both have a budget of $1 million. And so again, I'm looking at sort of column A and column B here. Both are $1 million. Say that you're spending 250 grand on climbing walls or whatever it is. So up until this point, they're the same. Say though, one of them needs a bunch of HVAC work, whereas one of them might just need some sort of like more minor fixes. So 150 grand is a very reasonable number for how much that can cost, versus, say, one that's a fraction of that. Say that there needs to be some structural work, or that you're adding a lift and you need an elevator or a lift, or maybe some roof work, or maybe it's even just more that it has a lot of demolition or other mechanical stuff. Whatever the case is, my point is that if you don't have to do that, on the right here, you might be able to stay a lot closer to that initial estimate of, say, $80 a foot. If you all of a sudden are having to take on a bunch more work, that might go up quite a bit. So, 120 versus 80, that's about a 50% more, another $40 on top of that 80. And so that has nothing to do though with like the stuff that you're putting inside of it. That has everything to do just with all of the work that you are having to do in the building, because it's sort of not up to snuff. And because when you have really low budgets, being able to focus your attention on this stuff, which is the stuff you need for your business, is really important because, even high budget projects still don't have enough money at the end of the day. Everybody sort of faces budget crunches no matter, who you are. Even in Saudi Arabia, they're building the crazy line project and they're talking about budget for a country that effectively has no budget. So my point is that there always is a budget. And so being able to sort of focus your dollars on the things you need and want versus all of the sort of stuff, different buildings. My point is different buildings have very different base building requirements. Sometimes this can get offloaded onto landlords if they're agreeable to that. But the point is that real estate evaluation and deal structuring, this is all of the sort of like not fun stuff that we need to get right so that we can actually focus on this stuff. And so that's why, again, base building evaluation is a sort of second thing that I want to talk about because I'm seeing over and over that the selection of the real estate is make or break for projects to pencil out from a business point of view. It's always been the case that way, but more and more, the cost of construction is so high that we're having to be even extra careful about it because the numbers are just bigger and the margins have not grown with that. So it gets sliced thinner and thinner. And so it's something that we just have to continue to be really careful about. The other thing that is coming up a lot more in line with that for ground up projects, we're really focusing on different aspects of prefabrication, which I've been working in prefabricated industries now for almost 25 years, from my first jobs making climbing walls, which was a lot of prefabricated panels, to housing, to, these days a lot more related to like metal buildings. The point is that these kind of prefabrication strategies are becoming almost one of the only ways to do bigger projects because of the cost related to ground up custom buildings. So we're really having to be more careful with the way that we are putting sort of building massing together for the sort of ground up projects, which frankly are a lot fewer and far between than what they were 10 years ago. But as a way to keep those budget numbers in line, prefabrication of sort of steel structures and different strategies is becoming something that I've always been a big fan of, but I think is even more important going forward. And so and I bring this up because we're in conversations on several projects right now with different building manufacturers. And so I'm just saying that, this is a very relevant conversation because it's not, just sort of doing what we want has always been sort of a dangerous way to operate from a budget point of view. But these days often leads to the sort of like, knee jerk, oh my, like that costs that much, we just can't do the project. And so we're really having to think through delivery strategy from the very beginning of projects, building delivery strategy. And so completely separate from that, all the sort of nuts and bolts stuff, while we're working so hard on putting our buildings and budgets together. The idea that these buildings need to be like really compelling and fun projects, as I think again more relevant than ever, because the competition for like the environments that we're creating is something that I'm also finding is worth taking a little more time to really like bake in the idea that these are really fun, attractive places to be. And what I mean by that is that that's a real business strategy. We're not just putting a few climbing walls or a few ramps in a space. That is really just checking boxes that in a more competitive environment, the clients I'm working with and the clientele that they're seeing coming into their facilities are much more nuanced than just saying it exists, therefore I will go to it, because there's so much more competition in every way, let alone within specific industries. And that's really where this whole idea of ecosystems continues to be the sort of way that I've been looking at it, which is this third place, meaning the home away from home, this ecosystem of how are you putting these things together so that they're really functional, multi-generational, multi-use facilities that are really catering to new people all the way up to professionals. And that has a lot to do with your market and what we sort of dial up. More fitness, more climbing, more training, more kids stuff, whatever the case is. You people, whatever the case is, That sort of ecosystem, I think, is even more important relative to your vision, and that's really where this whole idea of intent and the result and the criticism in between. The cycle that I go through with clients, and this is I've been teaching, design studios this way for a long time, just in college. But the idea is that we need to have our intent described well enough so that when we start seeing results, the criticism is really our conversation about, is it doing enough of what we want it to be doing, or do we need to keep working at it? Do we need to keep revisiting what our assumptions are, like how we actually get there? So the way that I look at this, just at a very simple level, you don't need to read all of this. The framework that I look at is really this wedge where we're just collecting ideas. We're collecting your goals and your sort of shopping list of the pieces that you need, and the different budgets and schedules and numbers that we put together. And what ends up happening is that really creates this environment that is the backdrop, the housing, like the sort of stage for the vision that you have. And as we loop around, as we start spinning this idea and going through it over and over, we really go from an assertion, which is this environment that we've imagined and sort of talked through and done the back of the envelope math with. Uh, the question really becomes, is this environment the stage for the users we're imagining to experience these activities? And so that we're really creating an environment for these activities. And the question really is that are these activities attracting your community in a natural way? Meaning we're putting these things together and putting the word out, we're programming it like our menu. Is this bringing our community together? And the mix of things and people we put together is really what creates the economic result, like, what the business does as a business. And that sort of feeds the question of, do we need to change that environment? And if so, that sort of leads to that second flywheel, that second round, where we just keep, in my opinion, the way that this is working is that we just keep spinning this over and over. And as we go around, the question goes from us making an assertion to us asking the question of, what do we hold on to? What can we get rid of? What do we need to replace? What do we need to do more of? What's coming next? We kind of go from an assertion to evaluation and questions of, what do we need to add? What do we need to take away? To what's next. And that's really the process of going over and over through a design and development process and project. And that's really, to me, more than people coming to me and saying, what is it that we should do? We could talk about that, but what really is more important is the process of having conversations and extracting information so that we can really dial in, like, what is it that we're really trying to do, and then evaluate that idea of criticism, which is it really doing the thing that we want it to do? This idea that criticism is the conversation between intent and the result we see. And so the result we see is literally the environment that we're walking in, and that we're not there to narrate, we're not there to tell people what it is. So criticism is really, is it doing the thing that we want it to do? Is it meeting the intent? And to me, this is that process. It's this collection and then this spinning over and over, where we go from just trying to get the pieces organized to, is it kind of doing enough? And it's almost like the sort of cooking metaphors that I like, it's the intent of, sweet, savory, spicy, what is it that we want it to be versus, in a maturing industry, there's a lot of options. So what is it that you want to be? This is what intent is. These are very different. They both sort of look like a burger if it was black and white, but very different intent. And so the technique that we actually put it together, and this sort of final step that I'm talking about, which is sort of seasoning it to taste. And this is maybe the newer part for anybody who's heard me talk like this idea of making sure it's not just checking the box. Like, we have to keep seasoning it. We have to keep doing that loop until we get to a point where it's worth the squeeze. Because for anybody, and I know some of the people on this project, or sorry, some of the people on this call are in this place, just talking with folks. We have to start with our goals, because it really is not easy to do this, to bring these projects to life. But once we start getting traction, a lot of times the projects get smaller. and that's fine. But we have to make sure we're getting enough out of it so that it still has that flavor that we want, that it still has the sort of core to it that we are excited about bringing to life and putting all the effort in, that we haven't diluted it so much that it's lost all its flavor, just to keep with this metaphor. And that's that sort of seasoning to taste. So that's what when I'm talking about this sort of a diagram, that's really what I'm talking about is collecting ideas, validating ideas with that sort of 30-second math, the numbers, the shopping list of ingredients, and then taking it through the flywheel. What's the environment we're creating? What are the activities we're using to create that environment? What is the community that is being attracted to that? And then what is the result we're getting out of that? And then the question is that working? Or do we need to change something? What do we need to hold on to? What do we need to get rid of? Those kind of questions. And then finally, what's next? Like, what does the future hold for us for the facility? And how can we sort of be open to that? And so that's why I have this sort of shown as 3 loops. It often is more than that, but that kind of looping is to me these days as key as ever, because again, the projects are just we're in a very challenging environment to be building, and so making sure that we have enough of the sort of like fun aspect, which is a strategic business. Doesn't sound like a technical idea, but to me, it's a very strategic business requirement. And so some examples, all kind of anonymous, are, we're doing a lot of facilities these days that are as much fitness as anything else. A lot of training facilities. This is a training and fitness facility with a strong wellness component. We're doing other facilities that are much more education based and arts based or food based. So, education, class, sort of food and climbing and fitness. And so, really sort of community centers as much as anything else, or multi-sport, again, multi-use, sort of multi-generational, really thinking through both youth, adults, recreational athletes, in this case, 3 Olympic sports, bizarrely, for any of us who started this 20 years ago, climbing, surfing, and skateboarding being in the Olympics. It's sort of interesting how that has evolved. And then constantly looking at the pricing and building strategies as well to try to be executing these, because what I can say when I look at these images is I just think of the conversations that are going on in the background related to, how do we actually land these things for a budget that works. And so those are all projects kind of going, a couple of projects actually being built. If you're interested in following, the folks over at Climb Nora are putting out their own content about how to build a climbing gym, something I like talking about. And folks over at Rock Climbing are also putting out content about their facility and how it goes together. And again, when I look at some of their imaging, I think back to our work, which is so much about balancing the business and the cost and the space needs as a collective thing. It's not just about pictures, it's about why the pictures look the way they do. What's the intent? And then the result we're seeing is that's the conversation that we have. And that's why to me, this isn't about a drawing, it's about the conversation and playing out that process of bringing an idea that often is not formed very clearly, clarifying it, putting numbers to it, putting narrative to it, and then really seeing what that shapes into. And then what does that mean for real estate? What does that mean for construction? What does that mean for everything? And then, being able to help clients bring him actually into the real world. That's the best part of it. And that's why everything I do is in service of trying to make something that we can afford, that will be a thriving business, but then also within that, how can we make it as amazing as possible? So that's kind of how I like to connect to different things. And I'm happy to, again, take any questions if people have them. But that's the end of the slides that I put together for. And if not, that is no problem as well. Yeah, thanks for coming, Jared. No problem.
Think so?
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. All right, Annie. Yeah. So Annie's asking a question. All right. So here comes some questions. Yeah. Economics of two-phase building, bouldering, then ropes. Yeah, that's an interesting one because one aspect of that, I've got two projects right now actually where that is a question, Annie. One of the aspects of it beyond the economics is how important the ropes are, meaning are the ropes aspect more important, not just from a like cost of building it point of view, but like does that have to be part of phase one as a differentiator or whatnot? I think in those two projects I'm thinking of, one, I think the answer is probably, and one, the answer is probably not. And so what I mean by that is that, there's climbing companies and franchises that do no ropes ever, practically, and do just fine. And so are ropes necessary? Like I don't they are in most cases, but I do understand and agree that they are a really good differentiator. And I think a lot of people, um, especially kids and adults who don't like jumping off of 14-foot boulders, myself included as I get older, I think ropes really are an important part potentially. So it just kind of depends. But from the economics point of view, to answer your question, there's just no doubt that doing a bouldering facility is a lot faster in most cases, unless you happen to find a space that's tall enough. I mean, Climb Nora on the screen is a great example of that. My first conversation with them was last summer and they're under construction. And so I say this to people all the time. If you have your money, if you are able to get your money lined up, if you're able to get a lease signed, getting you open or in construction in 12 months is entirely possible because we do it every year. But as long as a year can feel, it actually is very fast in the design and development world. So from the economics point of view, there's a lot to be said for just doing a bouldering facility and getting it going. Phasing is just a tricky conversation because things like bathrooms, even things like building structures, often relate to each other. Like, say, bathrooms, if you're just going to add on more space, your bathroom counts are a ratio of your usable area. And so, could you front load some of that? Maybe, but do you want to spend that money? So it's sort of a very nuanced conversation. But at the same time, what I would say is I think economically there's a lot to be said for getting something open and being able to add on from there, if that makes sense. But there's no doubt that bouldering in most cases is faster and cheap. Please shoot another note if I didn't quite answer that, Annie. Feel free. Nick's asking, what's the current mix of leasing versus buying versus building? It's a good question. I would say of those three options, leasing, buying, and building, I guess it's probably an even mix between those three. I've got several large building projects that are being considered. What I would say though is that the ones that are happening, leasing and renovating, whether you rent or buy, is happening far more frequently. Building ground up right now is still just a very tricky thing to do, which the other side of that is that the opportunity cost in terms of, other people trying to clear the same bar can be a lot higher. Like it's harder to do, which is a good thing if you can actually do it. So what I'm seeing a lot of is that very often most people I talk to, I would say like 9 out of 10 people, if not more, want to buy when they start. And the reality becomes that just isn't in the cards. I also have a client right now that I've been working with for a few years where project three is potentially a purchase, whereas project one and two were not. So, one thing I like to point out, and this kind of goes back to the phasing as well, is that it's not always like one size that you have to commit to for the life of your business. Again, that same client who's now working with bringing in larger funds for real estate purchase, they actually started a separate company for the real estate purchase versus the business operations, which is also common. Um, but that isn't where they started. When they started, it was a much smaller group. I was working directly with the two owners. Then they brought in more people for phase two. And then, sort of now that they're in phase three, there's even more people coming in. And so, it can sort of evolve in that way. And that's consistent with other businesses I've been a part of and other clients, even where often the first one, if you're just starting, the first one can be really hard. And there's just no two ways around it. Why is that? It's because, you're having to collateralize a lot of the debt unless you're someone who has funding from somewhere or someone close. Um, you don't have business operation history, things like that. Once you get going, the second one, the third one, especially the fourth and fifth one, start to become a lot easier because there's just a much bigger pool of sort of business operation and equity and collateral that you're pulling from. So there is just a lot to be said for getting going, which kind of goes back to that phasing question as well. Um, but what I would say is that, I'm seeing a lot of groups that are uh, certainly a lot of renovation right now. Existing assets, I think, are very valuable. I know developers who that's all they work on. They really refuse to build anything right now. People who are building, it's really important to have realistic budgets in mind, which is where that sort of ecosystem comes in. If you want to build a giant, very hyper dedicated climbing facility, you know, and you're going to pay $400 a foot, $300 a foot for that. I would say very few markets have enough members to support that. And even the ones that do probably have a lot of competition. So, how do you want to look at that? And, that's really where it becomes up to you as the owner. How do you want to, who are you trying to bring in? Who is the community that you're trying to bring in so that you have a wide enough reach with your business to have some resiliency and have some sort of longevity? And what I would say, as someone who I think used to be part of like the sort of very core climbing community, is that I think you can appeal to those people as well with like without you don't have to lose that entirely if that's important to you. But I do think that if you care about the business, it's a little bit of a different conversation than something that's very small and much more hyper focused, which I think is also possible. Again, alignment is the word I often use between the environment, the budget, and those expectations. So leasing, buying, ground up building. I'm actually seeing all of it. What I would say though is that landing the plane for new construction right now is a challenge. And I'm just thinking like I don't know when that's going to ease up, frankly. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying to figure out because I actually think there are ways to do it. Yeah, so follow up, does it allow you to get exactly what you need? Yeah, so building something new 100% is going to tailor the whole building for you. And the reality is if you want to have a facility that can be for training or for like top end competitions, you need 55 feet or something about there for climbing walls and whatnot. And you're just going to have a really hard time finding that. Even if you find it, it's probably going to be weird or whatever. Very few buildings are kind of equipped for that. So you're right. Then that's why people are doing it. The buildings that we're building are generally because the requirements dictate that we need to actually build something. I think the question becomes like, how much of that do we need to build? How much can we put in that space to make it really worthwhile, so that it can be an amazing space that is checking the boxes we need it to check so that it's tailored properly. So you're 100% right that like to achieve what is necessary for a lot of top end facilities, you need to be building most likely. I think that's exactly right. The question I have is, membership is not really going up necessarily in most cases. And so, we're at a bit of a time where construction has sort of jumped, but membership, if anything, is almost regressed a little because people are feeling, tighter economically. So that gap is really what the question that we're all thinking through, I think, is. What I can say is running some numbers on sort of mega facilities that have been built, say, in the last 10 to 20 years. Those numbers right now are extremely hard to think about how that works. So I don't know, just fully transparent. I'm not totally sure what the future is for some of these mega facilities if you care about being profitable. Does that mean that cities or governments or even national groups might not sponsor those? I mean, that's already happened. Like the group in like Chamonix and like some other of those mega climbing gyms are actually largely sometimes the government's involved in those for national teams. There's actually ways to adjust the math on that. And also, again, tactics like pre-engineered buildings is what I should say. We're trying to figure it out, I'll say. And so, but I also think that's where mixed use is so important because if you're not just a climbing membership business, the math can expand quite a bit. which brings those back into play, in my opinion. So thank you everybody for being here. I will send a follow-up note. And if you would like to have a follow-up talk with me, please feel free to reach out. But otherwise, hopefully that's at least just some of the things I'm seeing very much from the front line of developing these projects. I don't think any of it's necessarily revolutionary, but hopefully it helps in terms of where you're all at. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. And I look forward to speaking with you at some point in the future.